Hello, my name is John, and today we'll be reading FDR and the New Deal. This is a PowerPoint I presented to a class of 60 students some time ago. America came closest to a low-tax state through most of its history up until the mid-20th century. And as a consequence, it became the wealthiest society ever in the history of mankind. Paul Johnson. I advise people to please read Paul Johnson's book, A History of the American People, in which he states depressions are not part of a normal business cycle of expansion and contraction. They are a result of government interference and disruption of the free market and trade. According to this simplistic perspective, an important pillar of capitalism, the stock market, crashed and dragged America into depression. President Herbert Hoover, an advocate of hands-off or laissez-faire economic policy, refused to use the power of government, and conditions worsened as a result. It was up to Hoover's successor, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, to ride in on the white horse of government intervention and steer the nation toward recovery. The apparent lesson to be drawn is that capitalism cannot be trusted. Government needs to take an active role in the economy to save us from inevitable decline. Admirers of FDR's credit his New Deal with restoring the American economy after the disastrous contraction of 1929 to 1933. Truth to tell, as Powell demonstrates without a shadow of a doubt, the New Deal hampered recovery from the contraction, prolonged and added to unemployment, and set the stage for ever more intrusive and costly government. Powell's analysis is thoroughly documented, relying on an impressive variety of popular and academic literature, both contemporary and historical. Milton Friedman, Nobel laureate, Hoover Institution. Hoovervilles, named after President Hoover, who began the disastrous policies of the Great Depression. FDR expanded these policies and named it the New Deal. Most of these unemployed residents of the Hoovervilles begged for food from those fortunate enough to have housing during this era. Several other terms came into use during this era, such as Hoover blanket, old newspaper used as blanketing, and Hoover flag, an empty pocket turned inside out. Hoover leather was cardboard used to line a shoe with the sole worn through. A Hoover wagon was a car with horses tied to it because the owner could not afford gasoline. Did Hoover really subscribe to a hands-off the economy, free market philosophy? His opponent in the 1932 election, Franklin Roosevelt, didn't think so. During the campaign, Roosevelt blasted Hoover for spending and taxing too much, boosting the national debt, choking off trade, and putting millions on the dole. He accused the president of reckless and extravagant spending, of thinking that we ought to center control of everything in Washington as rapidly as possible, and of presiding over the greatest spending administration in peacetime and all of history. Roosevelt's running mate, John Nance Garner, charged that Hoover was leading the country down the path of socialism. Contrary to the conventional view about Hoover, Roosevelt and Garner were absolutely right. Based on his campaign promises, the electorate thought FDR would reduce the spending. Franklin Delano Roosevelt won the 1932 presidential election in a landslide, collecting 472 electoral votes to just 59 for the incumbent Herbert Hoover. The platform of the Democratic Party, whose ticket Roosevelt headed, declared, "We believe that a party platform is a covenant with the people, to be faithfully kept by the party entrusted with power." It called for a 25% reduction in federal spending, a balanced federal budget, a sound gold currency to be preserved at all hazards, the removal of government from areas that belong more appropriately to private enterprise, and an end to the extravagance of Hoover's farm programs. This is what candidate Roosevelt promised, but it bears no resemblance to what President Roosevelt actually delivered. In his first 100 days, he swung hard at the profit order. Instead of clearing away the prosperity barriers erected by his predecessor, he built new ones of his own. He struck in every known way at the integrity of the U.S. dollar through quantitative increases and qualitative deterioration. He seized the people's gold holdings and subsequently devalued the dollar by 40%. Frustrated and angered that Roosevelt had so quickly and thoroughly abandoned the platform on which he was elected, Director of the Bureau of the Budget, Lewis W. Douglas, resigned after only 1 year on the job. At Harvard University in May of 1935, Douglas made it plain that America was facing a momentous choice. We will choose to subject ourselves, this great country, to the despotism of bureaucracy, controlling our every act, destroying what equality we have attained, reducing us eventually to the condition of impoverished slaves of the state. Or will we cling to the liberties for which man has struggled for more than 1,000 years? It is important to understand the magnitude of the issue before us. If we do not elect to have a tyrannical, oppressive bureaucracy controlling our lives, destroying progress, depressing the standard of living, then should it not be the function of the federal government under the democracy to limit its activities to those which a democracy may adequately deal, for such an example as national defense, maintaining law and order, protecting life and property, preventing dishonesty, and guarding the public against vested special interests? In the first year of the New Deal, Roosevelt proposed spending $10 billion while revenues were only $3 billion. Between 1933 and 1936, government expenditures rose by more than 83%. Federal debt skyrocketed by 73%. Roosevelt secured passage of the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which levied a new tax on agricultural processors and used revenue to supervise the wholesale destruction of valuable crops and cattle. Federal agents oversaw the ugly spectacle of perfectly good fields of cotton, wheat, and corn being plowed under. Healthy cattle, sheep, and pigs were slaughtered and buried in mass graves. Secretary of Agriculture Henry Wallace personally gave the order to slaughter 6 million baby pigs before they grew to full size. The administration also paid farmers for the first time for not working at all. Even if the AAA had helped farmers by curtailing supplies and raising prices, it could have done so only by hurting millions of others who had to pay those prices or make do with less to eat. Such Roosevelt mania is hardly surprising. America is in the grip of its biggest house cleaning since the Depression, a house cleaning that has already closed investment banks and shrunk pension portfolios and is now rippling through the real economy. The political playing field has also tilted leftward. Mr. Obama received a higher proportion of the popular vote than all but one Democratic presidential nominee since FDR. Many liberals would like to turn it towards a New Deal. Washington is currently buzzing with talk of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Members of Mr. Obama's inner circle are reading up on FDR's first 100 days. No political conversation is complete without a knowing reference to the Squire of Hyde Park, FDR. Both Time on the cover and the New Yorker on an inside page feature pictures of Mr. Obama as FDR, smoking a cigarette, driving an open-top car, and looking very much as though he has nothing to fear but fear itself. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, Americans desperately needed bargains, but Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed laws that forced businesses to charge above market prices for everything. He made discounting a crime. FDR did this even though antitrust laws provided penalties for private individuals who acted in restraint of trade and charged above market prices. These laws were passed by progressive, his ideological brethren. FDR first established the National Industrial Recovery Act, considered the flagship of the New Deal. FDR signed that in June of 1933, climaxing his heroic 100 days of legislative mania. Back then, the economic situation was considered so urgent that members of Congress didn't have time to seriously debate FDR's proposals. The members probably didn't have time to read the bills either before the voting began. Possibly the 100th days began the American tradition of having members of Congress vote on bills they haven't read. How FDR promoted price gouging. In any case, the National Industrial Recovery Act authorized the president to establish cartels, meaning monopolies, via executive orders. He established some 500 cartels, and one of the things they did was fix prices above market levels. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, 1933, another triumph of the 100 days, aimed to raise prices of agricultural commodities above market levels in an effort to raise farm incomes. Apparently, the authors of the Agricultural Adjustment Act weren't particularly concerned about the 3/4 of the U.S. population who weren't farmers and had to pay more for food. The AAA was the brainchild of FDR's Secretary of Agriculture and future Vice President, so-called farm dictator Henry Wallace, who was reportedly most impressed with Soviet collective farming. Wallace would run for president in 1948 on the communist-inspired Progressive Party ticket. He hired Alger Hiss at the AAA, who worked with the Rosenbergs to steal nuclear technology for the Soviet Union. Why did FDR destroy all that food when millions were hungry? FDR promoted higher food prices by paying farmers to plow under some 10 million acres of crops and slaughter and discard some 6 million farm animals. The food destruction program mainly benefited big farmers, since they had more food to destroy than small farmers. This policy and subsequent programs to pay farmers for not producing victimized the 100 million Americans who were consumers. Why did FDR triple federal taxes during the Great Depression? Federal tax revenues more than tripled from $1.6 billion in 1933 to $5.3 billion in 1940. Excise taxes, personal income taxes, inheritance taxes, corporate income taxes, holding company taxes, and excess profits taxes all went up. FDR introduced an undistributed profits tax. Consumers had less money to spend, and employers had less money for growth and jobs. Is government a more efficient and cautious steward of public money than families and companies? Why did FDR discourage investors from taking the risks of funding growth and jobs? Frequent tax hikes, 1933, 1934, 1935, 1936, created uncertainty that discouraged investment, and FDR further discouraged investors by announcing them as economic royalists, economic dictators, and privileged princes, among other epithets. No surprise that private investment was at historically low levels during the new era of the New Deal. Young men left home when they were about 16 years just so the family would not have another mouth to feed. Many of these boys would end up getting suckered into laboring in work camps, which were nothing more than slave labor camps, with whippings and other abuses. They were paid slave wages of $1 a day when prices were kept high by the government. The title of this political cartoon was "Ring Around Mr. Rosie, Pocket Full of Doughy." Why did FDR channel government spending away from the poorest people? Little New Deal spending went to the South, the poorest region. Most went to the political swing states in the East and the West, where incomes were more than 60% higher. The South was already overwhelmingly on FDR's side. FDR was buying votes with people's money. L. Rogers from the Chicago Defender, the leading black newspaper in the United States. This is one from May 26, 1934, and compares the Agricultural Adjustment Administration to a modern Simon Legree because of policies that drove many blacks off the land. Simon Legree was the infamous slave owner who ignored human suffering in the famous novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. During FDR's decade-and-a-half rule, black unemployment rose to 50%. Black Americans were particularly hard hit by the Depression. Sharecroppers in the South were put out of business by the AAA legislation and forced into government welfare called FARA. The blacks had traded the slave plantation of pre-Civil War South for the political plantation of the Democratic Party. And incidentally, from that point on, the 90% vote that Republicans expected for blacks became the 94% vote for the Democratic Party. Why did FDR make it more expensive for employers to hire people? By enforcing above-market wages, introducing excise taxes on payrolls, and promoting compulsory unionism, the New Deal increased the cost of employing people by 25% from 1933 to 1940, a major reason why double-digit private sector unemployment persisted throughout the New Deal era. There were no jobs. FDR taxed wages and companies heavily, so there was no money to hire new employees or expand business. FDR had all the money and would provide 8 million jobs. Why did FDR make everything more expensive during the Depression? Americans needed bargains, but FDR signed the National Industrial Recovery Act to establish some 500 industrial cartel codes that forced consumers to pay above market prices for goods and services. Price fixing. Moreover, he banned discounting by signing the Anti-Chain Store Act, 1936, and the Retail Price Maintenance Act, 1937. Ayn Rand wrote Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, decrying the mediocrity of people losing moral courage and seeking political patronage. Why did FDR break up the strongest banks? FDR broke up the strongest banks, which diversified with both commercial banking and investment banking. FDR's Federal Deposit Insurance didn't stop bank failures, but it transferred the cost to taxpayers. About 90% of bank failures occurred because of unit banking laws that prevented small banks from diversifying through branches. Almost all the failed banks were in states with unit banking laws that prohibited banks from opening branches and thereby diversifying their portfolios and reducing their risks, Powell writes. Although the United States, with its unit banking laws, had thousands of bank failures, Canada, which permitted branch banking, didn't have a single failure. What was the point of New Deal securities laws that made it harder for employers to raise capital and didn't help investors do better? Employers desperately needed to raise capital, but FDR made this harder. New Deal security laws led to costly regulations for issuing stock. These laws impeded the raising of capital. The rate of return from new stock issues failed to improve after the SEC was established. The SEC was run by a rum runner, Joseph Kennedy. How did the Tennessee Valley Authority become a drag on the economy? FDR taxed 98% of the American people who didn't live in Tennessee, then used this revenue for the TVA power generating monopoly, exempt from federal and state taxes and regulations. But non-TVA southern states such as North Carolina and Georgia grew faster than TVA states because there was a faster exodus out of farming and into manufacturing and services, which offered higher incomes. Why did FDR disrupt companies employing millions? In 1938, FDR authorized an unprecedented barrage of antitrust lawsuits against about 150 employers and industries. FDR had big employers tied up in court, discouraging investment for growth and jobs. It's ironic, political historians give FDR credit for handling the political crises of the 1930s, even though the most important factor in the crises was double-digit private sector unemployment prolonged by FDR's misguided policies. Yeah, great era, FDR, isn't it? You didn't have a job. Sorry, buddy. This expansive joblessness caused many families to go without food, clothing, or shelter necessary for simple day-to-day living. Suicide rates climbed, leaving mothers alone to tend to children with no income. Soup lines sprouted up around the country in an effort to combat the growing number of migrant workers and starving families. long lines everywhere. The struggle over economic policies in the 1930s was really an episode in the long historical conflict between business participants in the market and anti-business academics. Roosevelt gave free rein to the professors until the start of the Second World War led him to realize that he would need the tycoons to help mobilize to defeat Hitler. Newt Gingrich. I suspect that one reason that Roosevelt and the New Deal come off so well in the conventional wisdom is that history books are written by professors, not by entrepreneurs. Newt Gingrich. Perhaps the most radical aspect of the New Deal was the National Industrial Recovery Act, passed in June of 1933, which created a massive new bureaucracy called the National Recovery Administration. Under the NRA, most manufacturing industries were suddenly forced into government-mandated cartels. Codes that regulated prices and terms of sale briefly transformed much of the American economy into a fascist-style arrangement. You read that right. Fascist-style arrangement. FDR was a fascist, while the NRA was financed by new taxes on the very industries it controlled. Some economists have estimated that the NRA boosted the cost of doing business by an average of 40%, not something a depressed economy needed for recovery. The economic impact of the NRA was immediate and powerful. In the 5 months leading up to the Act's passage, signs of recovery were evident. Factory employment and payrolls had increased by 23 and 35% respectively. Then came the NRA shortening hours of work, raising wages arbitrarily, and imposing other new costs on enterprise. In the 6 months after the law took effect, industrial production dropped 25%. Benjamin M. Anderson writes, NRA was not a revival measure. It was an anti-revival measure. Through the whole of the NRA period, industrial production did not rise as high as it had been in July of 1933, before NRA came in. The man Roosevelt picked to direct the NRA effort was General Hugh Iron Pants Johnson, a profane, red-faced bully and professed admirer of Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. Thunder Johnson, may Almighty God have mercy on anyone who attempts to interfere with the Blue Eagle. The official symbol of the NRA, which one senator derisively referred to as the Soviet duck. Those who refused to comply with the NRA, Johnson personally threatened with public boycotts and a punch in the nose. There were ultimately more than 500 NRA codes. By the way, bullying is what the Democrats do best, ranging from the production of lightning rods to the manufacture of corsets and brassieres, covering more than 2 million employers and 22 million workers. There were codes for the production of hair tonic, dog leashes, and even musical comedies. A New Jersey tailor named Jack Majid was arrested and sent to jail for the crime of pressing a suit of clothes for 35 cents rather than the NRA-inspired tailor's code of 40 cents. Jail for a nickel. The NRA was discovered it could not enforce its rules. Black markets grew up. Only the most violent police methods could procure employment. In Sidney Hillman's garment industry, the code authority employed enforcement police. They roamed through the garment district like stormtroopers. They could enter a man's factory, send him out, line up his employees, subject them to minute interrogation take over his books on the instant. Night work was forbidden. Flying squadrons of these private coat and suit police went through the district at night, bullying people, thanks Democrats, bullying people, battering down doors with axes looking for men who were committing the crime of sewing together a pair of pants at night. Thank you, Democrats. But without these harsh methods, many code authorities said there could be no compliance because the public was not in support. To many Americans, the National Recovery Administration's bureaucracy and mind-numbing regulations became known as a national runaround. It was also known as a Soviet duck. In 1933, FDR put Hugh Johnson in charge of the National Recovery Administration. Times said Johnson burst like a flaming meteorite on the country, January 1st, 1934, and made him Man of the Year for 1933. Quoting the New York Times, Times said Johnson, a soldier, lawyer, and manufacturer, had been offered almost unlimited powers. He was faltering badly by 1934, which historians ascribe to the profound contradictions in NRA policies, compounded by heavy drinking on the job. Roosevelt replaced him in September 1934 and let him have a WPA position. Johnson supported Roosevelt in 1936, but when the court-packing plan was announced in 1937, he denounced Roosevelt as a would-be dictator. The most serious political criticism was that Roosevelt was building a nationwide political machine with millions of workers. Yes, exactly, along Soviet lines. The laborers and the farmers became the base for his political class. Some who were critical of the WPA referred to it as "we poke along," "we piddle around," "we putter along," or the whistle, piss, and argue gang. These were sarcastic references to WPA projects that sometimes slowed to a crawl because foremen on a government project devised to maintain employment often had no incentive or ability to influence worker productivity by demotion or termination. Typical of government unions, by the way. This criticism was due in part to the WPA's early practice of basing wages on a security wage, ensuring workers would be paid even if the project was delayed, improperly constructed, or incomplete. Other denigrating references to the WPA in popular culture included Harper Lee's 1960s novel, To Kill a Mockingbird, noted a typical comment. Bob Ewell, the resident slacker of Macomb County, is described as the only person fired from the WPA for laziness. WPA employed some 8 million Americans, the largest employer during the Depression years, with a salary of $19 a month, up to $94 a month. Wages that were illegal for private businesses. The jobs often involved living on site and projects of heavy construction type work done by manual labor. It's very Stalinistic, isn't it? Business was not allowed to bid or compete for these projects since they could have done it more easily and efficiently using heavy equipment like tractors. Even a famous WPA skit derided the workers as the lean-on-the-shovel gang. This contemporary political cartoon derides the politicization of American workers by Harry Hopkins, who infamously said, "We shall tax, and spend, and elect, and elect." Exactly, the motto of the Democratic Party. WPA, oh, how wonderful. One of Roosevelt's critics was the inimitable sage of Baltimore, H.L. Mencken, who rhetorically threw everything but the kitchen sink at the president. Paul Johnson sums up Mencken's stinging but often humorous barbs this way. Mencken excelled himself in attacking the triumphant FDR, whose whiff of fraudulent collectivism filled him with genuine disgust. He was the Führer, the quack, surrounded by an astonishing rabble of impudent nobodies, a gang of half-educated pedagogues, non-constitutional lawyers, starry-eyed uplifters, and other such sorry wizards. His New Deal was a political racket, a series of stupendous bogus miracles, with its constant appeals to class envy and hatred, treating government as a milch cow with 125 million tits, and marked by frequent repudiations of categorical pledges. The men the American public admire most extravagantly are the most daring liars. In other words, FDR was a con man. The men they detest most violently are those who try to tell them the truth. H.L. Mencken. Almost the first American emperor, he was elected a record 4 times, and it wasn't until he tried to pack the Supreme Court with justices in favor of his causes that Congress finally woke up and passed the 22nd Amendment, which limited how long a president could serve, but not a congressman. Heavens no. King Franklin I, also known as FDR, was not a good monarch. Between the New Deal, treatment of Japanese Americans, and being generally unconstitutional, King Franklin I cannot be called a great ruler. Shipping off Japanese Americans into an internment camp, after, of course, robbing them of their possessions. The Wagner Act, or the Second New Deal, since the first one did not work and was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. The stage was set for the 1937-38 collapse with the passage of the National Labor Relations Act in 1935, better known as the Wagner Act and Organized Labor's Magna Carta. Wagner Act, by the way, is what cemented the Democratic Party as a ruling party for several generations. This law revolutionized American labor relations. It took labor disputes out of the courts of law and brought them under a newly created federal agency, the National Labor Relations Board, which became prosecutor, judge, and jury all in one. Goodbye, rule of law. Labor union sympathizers on the board further perverted this law, which already afforded legal immunities and privileges to labor unions. The U.S. thereby abandoned a great achievement of Western civilization, equality under the law. The Wagner Act, or National Labor Relations Act, was passed in reaction to the Supreme Court's avoidance of NRA and its labor codes. It aimed at crushing all employer resistance to labor unions. Anything an employer might do in self-defense became an unfair labor practice, punishable by the board. The law not only obliged employers to deal and bargain with the unions designated as the employee's representative. Later board decisions also made it unlawful to resist the demands of labor union leaders. Armed with these sweeping new powers, labor unions went on a militant organizing frenzy, Threats, boycotts, strikes, seizures of plants, and widespread violence pushed productivity down sharply and unemployment up dramatically. Membership in the nation's labor union soared. By 1941, there were 2.5 times as many Americans in unions as had been the case in 1935. Historian William E. Leuchtenberg, himself no friend of free enterprise, observed, property-minded citizens were scared by the seizure of factories, incensed when strikers interfered with the mails, vexed by the intimidation of non-union workers, and alarmed by flying squadrons of workers who marched or threatened to march from city to city. Still stinging from his earlier Supreme Court defeats, Roosevelt tried in 1937 to pack the Supreme Court with a proposal to allow the president to appoint an additional justice to the court for every sitting justice who had reached the age of 70 and did not retire. Had this proposal passed, Roosevelt would have appointed 6 new justices favorable to his view, increasing the members of the court from 9 to 15. His plan failed in Congress, but the court later began rubber stamping his policies after a number of opposing justices retired. Until Congress killed the packing scheme, however, business fears that a court sympathetic to Roosevelt's goals would endorse more of the old New Deal prevented investment and confidence from reviving. The relentless assaults of the Roosevelt administration in both word and deed against business, property, and free enterprise guaranteed that the capital needed to jumpstart the economy was either taxed away or forced into hiding. When FDR took America to war in 1941, he eased up on his anti-business agenda, but a great deal of the nation's capital was diverted into war effort instead of into plant expansion or consumer goods. Not until both Roosevelt and the war were gone did investors feel confident enough to set in motion the post-war investment boom that powered the economy's return to sustained prosperity. This view gained support in these comments from one of the country's leading investors of the time, Lamont DuPont, offered in 1937. Uncertainty rules the tax situation, the labor situation, the monetary situation, and practically every legal condition under which industry must operate. Are taxes to go higher, lower, or stay where they are? We don't know. Is labor to be union or non-union? Are we to have inflation or deflation? More government spending or less? Are new restrictions to be placed on capital? New limits on profits? It is impossible to even guess at the answers. Many modern historians tend to be reflectively anti-capitalist and distrustful of free markets. They find Roosevelt's exercise of power, constitutional or not, to be impressive and historically interesting. But when a nationally represented poll by the American Institute of Public Opinion in the spring of 1939 asked, "Do you think the attitude of the Roosevelt administration toward business is delaying business recovery?" The American people responded yes, by a margin more than 2-1. The business community felt even more strongly so. In his private diary, FDR's very own Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau, seemed to agree. He wrote, "We have tried spending money. We are spending more money than we have ever spent before, and it does not work. We have never made good on our promises. I say after 8 years of this administration, we have just as much unemployment as when we started, and an enormous debt to boot. At the end of the decade, and 12 years after the stock market crash of Black Thursday, 10 million Americans were jobless. The unemployment rate was in excess of 17%. Roosevelt had pledged in 1932 to end the crisis, but it persisted 2 presidential terms and countless interventions later. And let's not forget Yalta. FDR sold out the Allies and lost half of Europe to Stalin. Was it a shrewd move? Churchill didn't think so. Stalin thought FDR just wanted it to all go away. FDR was in his final days, and it showed. For whatever the reasons, hundreds of millions lived in squalor and oppression for decades, and FDR played a big part in that. This video is a production of the School of the White Crane. My name is John Brooker, and you could reach me through commentary on this video or through my Gmail listed here. Please share this video with family and friends and on social media. May God richly bless you, my beloved.